Welcome to the course and our first video presentation. Today we're going to ask a couple of burning questions. What is poetry and why bother with it? Let's start simple. The most basic unit of a poem is the line. Now, is there such a thing as a one-line poem? Well, sure. It's called a monostitch. Here's an example from a 14th century Persian poet named Hafiz. I have enough of loss, enough of gain. I have my love. What more can I obtain? Meet the stanza. Lines are arranged into stanzas. A group of two lines is called a couplet. A three-line stanza is a tercet. A four-line stanza, a quatrain. And a five-line stanza, a quintet. Two other common stanza lengths are the sestet, which is 6 lines, and the octave, which is 8 lines. Now, just writing lines and arranging them into stanzas doesn't make a poem, not necessarily. So, what is poetry? Well, according to Britannica, it is literature that evokes a concentrated imaginative awareness of experience or a specific emotional response through language chosen and arranged for its meaning, sound, and rhythm. Whew, boy, that's a mouthful. Well, in fact, poetry's tough to define. And truth be told, there are as many definitions of poetry as there are poets. One that I like comes from the Argentinian short story writer and poet Jorge Luis Borges. Poetry is something that cannot be defined without oversimplifying it. It would be like attempting to define the color yellow, love, or the fall of leaves in autumn. Here, Borges is telling us that poetry transcends definition. You know it when you see it. Or as Emily Dickinson once said, if I feel physically as if the top of my head was taken off, I know that is poetry. Now, maybe a better question to ask here in the 21st century is why bother with poetry? Well, because of what poetry can do. One answer comes from the Pulitzer Prize winning poet Stephen Dunn. In his poem for people understandably too busy to read poetry, he writes, here's what poetry can do. Imagine yourself a caterpillar. There's an awful shrug, and suddenly you're beautiful for as long as you live. Here, Dunn suggests the poetry has the power to change us for the better, the power to transform, the power to speak to us beyond the literal and reach some deeper part of ourselves. It's powerful stuff. Or at least it can be if we're open to it. So, how should we approach poetry? Are you going to need a decoder ring? I mean, look, I know a lot of people think poetry is something that has to be decoded or deciphered, and That's why they don't like it. And frankly, I can't blame them. Sometimes the language doesn't speak to them. But if you pay attention, you'll notice something about poetry that it uses both denotation and connotation. Now, denotation is the direct definition of a word that you find in the dictionary. I can remember it this way: D for dictionary, D for denotation. Connotation is the emotional suggestions of a word that's not literal. Poetry uses both, but poems are typically much more connotative. That's why we shouldn't try to torture confessions out of them. And while some poetry can be a bit on the esoteric side, this semester I'm going to present you with relatively straightforward poems in relatively straightforward language and share some tools that will help you understand, enjoy, and I hope be somehow changed in your encounters with them. Let's start with a poem and see what we can learn from it. It was written by a very famous living poet named Billy Collins, twice named the United States Poet Laureate. That's our national poet. His poems don't take any pains to hide their meaning. They're living things comprised of everyday language. Our first poem is called, aptly enough, Introduction to Poetry. First, let's listen to Collins read it. Introduction to Poetry. I ask them to take a poem and hold it up to the light like a color slide, or press an ear against its hive. I say, drop a mouse into a poem and watch him probe his way out, or walk inside the poem's room and feel the walls for a light switch. I want them to water ski across the surface of a poem, waving at the author's name on the shore. But all they want to do is tie the poem to a chair with rope and torture a confession out of it. They begin beating it with a hose to find out what it really means. So let's take a closer look at the poem. Let's see how it's arranged on the page. It's rather tidy. No superfluous words, nothing tricky, just simple everyday language. And yet, it's anything but. Note how Collins reads the poem. He doesn't pause at the end of the lines. He reads through those lines in a continuous flow until the period tells him to stop. That flow across lines or stanzas is called enjambment. Another thing to note before we take a deeper dive into the poem is the distinction between the author of the poem, Collins, and what we call the poem's speaker. Here, it seems fairly obvious that the speaker is a teacher or a college professor like me, perhaps. So, what can we learn from the first stanza? I asked them to take a poem and hold it up to the light like a color slide. One of the first things you'll probably notice is the simile in the third line, like a color slide. Now, if you don't remember from high school, where they probably installed your anti poetry deflector shields, a simile is a comparison of unlike things using like or as. Here, Collins compares the poem to a color slide. A color slide is a transparency, and you can't see what's on that transparency until light is shined through it. Here, Collins is asking us to examine the poem from different angles, to note its visual imagery, and not to worry too much about what the poem means. As we'll see, imagery is an important element of poetry. In the next line, or press an ear against its hive, Collins compares the poem to a beehive. This kind of comparison is called a metaphor. Like the simile, it compares unlike things. It just doesn't use like or as. So, if the first stanza is asking us to pay attention to the poem's visual imagery, the second is asking us to listen to the sounds of the poem's words. Words have meanings, but words also are sounds. And in poetry, the sounds of words is incredibly important, just like it is in music, and especially in genres like hip hop. Believe it or not, the earliest forms of poetry were meant to be sung or recited with musical accompaniment. Now let's see what's in store for us next. Collins writes, I say, drop a mouse into a poem and watch him probe his way out. Here, the metaphor transforms the poem into a maze. And if the poem is the maze, metaphorically speaking, we're the mouse. Collins is asking us, like the mouse, to wander through the poem's twists and turns, to pay attention to the poem's structure. All poems have structure. It's what we call poetic form. And as we'll learn next week, in formal verse, each poem's form is determined by a strict set of rules. However, in free verse poetry of the type Collins and the majority of contemporary poets write today, the form is determined by the poet. The next lines, or walk inside the poem's room and feel the walls for a light switch. Now the poem is a darkened room. Does Collins mean we're in the dark when we're reading a poem until we find that magic switch that reveals its meaning? I don't think so. We've all been in a situation before, one time or another. When we find the light switch and flip it, the light simply helps us find our way. Metaphorically speaking, perhaps what Collins is saying is that the light of our imagination can help us navigate the poem and reveal its beauty. I want them to water ski across the surface of a poem, waving at the author's name on the shore. In this stanza of the poem, Collins points to the sheer joy that poetry can bring us, so we're grateful to the author. Interestingly, the poet isn't in the poem. We are, and we don't need the poet's help when it comes to enjoying or understanding the text. In the last two stanzas, our little poem takes a sinister turn. Its tone shifts. Tone typically refers to the mood implied by the author's word choice and the way a text can make the reader feel. So, what does this all mean when he writes, but all they want to do is tie the poem to a chair with rope and torture a confession out of it? They begin beating it with a hose to find out what it really means. The final metaphor of the poem is that of a prisoner with a secret. But anyone who knows anything about torture knows that it rarely produces any real answers. And in a lot of poetry, there aren't specific answers for what the poem means. Here, Collins is exhorting us to forget about what the poem means and just experience the poem as the poem. Now, if we had a direct answer for what the poem is sharing with us, then we wouldn't need the poem to express that. Poems are often more about emotion than intellect, though many poems have something important to tell us about our experience of the world. So, have we defined poetry? Probably not. but we have gained some valuable tools when it comes to approaching poems. With Colin's help, we've learned about the line, stanza, imagery, poetic form, simile, metaphor, and the sound of language. Most of all, we've been relieved of the responsibility for having to figure out what a poem really means. We can just enjoy each one for what it is. That said, when we take a closer look at a poem, conduct an analysis, we can learn a lot about it. Going forward, I want you to use the terms we learned in this lesson in your discussion posts and your essays. And when you read this week's poem, be on the lookout for imagery, the sounds of words, metaphors, and similes. Consider each poem's structure and how it's arranged on the page. Read them aloud and consider the poem's tone. Finally, don't try to torture a confession out of it. Professor Helms signing off. We'll see you next time.